Hello and welcome back to a brand new episode of the Moran Show. We're recording this shortly after Thursday Night Football, where the Eagles beat the Vikings 34-28. And joining me tonight is Mr. John Tortorelli. What did you think about the game?
This was a game that probably shouldn't have been a one-score affair. The Vikings came back and made it pretty interesting. But where last year they're 11-0 one-score games, this year 0-2 to start.
Now, Jalen Hurts, Mr. Jalen Hurts, is 19-1 in his last 20 regular season starts. Only other quarterbacks to accomplish 19 plus wins in 20 games in the Super Bowl era are Patrick Mahomes, Peyton Manning, Joe Montana, Tom Brady, and Jim McMahon. What do you make of this stat?
It sounds like you named to me the five greatest quarterbacks of all time, and then there's this 250 quarterback drop off when we get to the Bears, like fifth all time passing leader. No, McMahon's second. He's second, but a pretty steep contrast there between the first five.
Now, listen, the highlight of this game was DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift was phenomenal. I believe he went for 167 yards. No, he went 175 yards, 28 carries, 6.3 yards per carry, and one touchdown. But the first topic we're going to dive into on this show is Jalen Hurts. Why did Jalen Hurts struggle? On the box score, 18 for 23, 193 yards, one touchdown to one interception, a 98 passer rating, and he had two touchdowns on the ground that were quarterback sneaks. He is the best quarterback at doing that behind that elite offensive line. But the numbers don't really tell the full story. So, what did you think of Jalen Hurts' performance?
To me, it was pretty disappointing. He does finish with only five incompletions. But last year, we're also ready to throw Hurts to that top five quarterback level with with Allen, with Burrow. But I feel like one of the things that lacked relative to some of those guys was his pocket presence. I felt like tonight, with the Vikings being so aggressive defensively of Brian Flores, there were many times where they were playing that heavy zone. They maybe were even rushing three or four guys. And you saw Hurts leave the pocket looking to rush. And so the game plan for the Eagles became ground and pound, opposed to beating you through the air. And where last year Shane Steichen, you saw this offense beat you from every single level, they feel a bit one-dimensional now with a new play caller. AJ Brown's not getting the ball in the middle of the field. We see none of those crossers or slants. And it really relied on, a Vikings broken coverage to get into a rhythm here. So I think Jalen Hurts still has to get better. Like we compare him to, again, guys like Josh Allen. I think right now you look at a player like Kyler Murray, and I'm like, Kyler Murray's got that pocket presence to beat you week in and week out, and he's not going to evade. And I feel like that is one thing that does not get talked about enough here, Jalen.
Now, before this season, when we did our NFC East preview show and we talked about the Philadelphia Eagles, I mentioned the area and where the Eagles offense can regress and how defenses are going to play the Eagles coming into 2023. Because last season, it was no secret. The Eagles had the easiest schedule in the NFL. They faced a very soft schedule of defenses, but the two things that I felt like were weaknesses in Jalen Hurts' game is his ability to throw under pressure and also his ability versus man compared to zone. Pressure versus no pressure, these are his splits in terms of EPA per attempt. With pressure, he's 35th in EPA per attempt. Without pressure, he's 11th in EPA per attempt. Man versus zone coverage. Versus zone, he's 27th in EPA per attempt. And versus man, he's 7th in EPA per attempt. Now, this is another important stat. Versus zone, the Eagles allowed a similar pressure rate, 29% to 27%. Yet, Jalen Hurts took a sack 8.4% of the time versus zone. Versus man, it was 3.1%. So last year, we saw this trend where when teams play zone defense on Jalen Hurts, it has him hold on to the ball just that split second longer, and it leads to more sacks. Now, last year, the only two zone heavy defensive teams that played against the Eagles were the Colts and were the Green Bay Packers. And even then, they played zone defense at an above average rate. This year, the Eagles are going to have a much tougher schedule in terms of defenses. And Jalen Hurts through two games. I mentioned last week, week one, as a potential upset for the Eagles versus the Patriots because I thought the Patriots defense would have a great game plan against the Philadelphia Eagles. Jalen Hurts took 3 sacks versus the Patriots and 4 sacks versus the Vikings. On the season, Jalen Hurts has an 11.5% sack rate. Last year, the worst team in the NFL at sack rate was the Chicago Bears at 13.33%. Number 31 was the LA Rams at 10%, meaning right now through 2 games, which is a very small sample size, but Jalen Hurts is at the bottom of the league in terms of handling pressure in the pocket. His pocket presence to me is kind of regressed, and we saw it very early in the in the first half where the Vikings game plan, Brian Flores' game plan for this game was very easy. We're gonna play a soft zone. We're not gonna rush much because for one, we don't trust our corners on the back end
No,
to
no.
go toe to toe with Devontae Smith and AJ Brown. So
And he
we
got
have
it.
to help on the back end. We are going to trust our front four to get home against this elite offensive line. And there were moments where Jalen Hurts would drift into pressure. There were moments where Jalen Hurts on the 3rd and long doesn't see what he likes initially, and he's already bailing out the pocket and scrambling. And that's another concern for me when he's scrambling so much, he's taking those hits, he's having those defenders land on his legs. For me, as somebody watching him, the Eagles just paid him. That's not something I want to see. And right now, Jalen Hurts, I know the stats still look good for him in the second half. He had a great passer rating, but even in the second half, it was 3rd and 22. 3rd and 22 because they got set back by a penalty. And this was a crucial moment in the game. 3rd and long, Jalen Hurts drifts into Daniil Hunter. It's now a 4th and 34, knocking the Eagles out of field goal range. We just saw Jake Elliott hit a 60-yard field goal. It knocked the Eagles out of field goal range, and they had to punt the ball, and then the Vikings go and they score a touchdown, making it a closer game than it had to be. To me, it's just 2 games, right? And we've seen the best of quarterbacks face defenses that have adjusted to them. Like last year, Joe Burrow versus Too High, and they overcame it. Jalen Hurts still has time. I'm not saying he's a finished product, but right now, it is pretty clear that defenses and coaches looked at what he didn't do well last year, and that's how they're playing him this year.
And that's the evolution for every great quarterback, right? Because he was an MVP candidate last year in All Pro. As you mentioned, Burrow and Mahomes both had to face those 2 high shells. And once they beat them, they became basically, for the most part, unstoppable. And so you play
Yeah.
the Cleveland Browns apparently week 1. So for Jalen Hurts, like this is the next step for him to become that solidified top 5 quarterback. And I think he will. But I agree with you. He was hit 12. He rushed today 12 times for 35 yards. He was hit over half a dozen times in the first quarter. And there's so many plays where he's elusive enough to get out of bounds, evading guys for first downs. But at the end of the day, it's like, Jalen, we need to slide, dog. You may be 25 years old, but at a certain point, you're too important to this team. And you look at this offense with how good Devontae Smith and AJ Brown make them over the top. You take Jalen Hurts out the game and you plug in a Marcus Mariota, your season's over. Like last year, Gardner Minshew, he could at least take the top off. And we had moments against the Cowboys where he can make some big time plays. So he is even more vital this year. And like I said, again, we expect him to take that jump. But until he does, I don't think he's in that same exact tier. We'll pause the
So
brakes a little bit. Eagle fans are going to hate me for that. But we got to pause the brakes a little bit.
you mentioned Brian Johnson, and here was kind of my issue with the discourse around the Eagles heading into 2023. They lost Shane Steichen. They lost Jonathan Gannon. They lost TJ Edwards. They lost Kaiser White. They lost CJ Gardner Johnson. They lost Marcus Epps. They lost half of their defensive starters. And people were just like, okay, we're going to plug in Cam Jurgens and he'll be better than Isaac Samalu. For me, it's like the losses the Eagles had were big time losses. Continuity is a big thing in the NFL. And right now, the laser is pointed at Brian Johnson because he's the one that is now calling plays for this offense. And this offense, compared to last year, looks totally different. I think this offense isn't playing to Jalen Hurts' strength. Last year, we saw a bunch of RPO concepts around the run game. So basically, defenses really didn't know how to guard the Eagles because their run concepts would look very similar to their passing concepts. Where this year, it's not like that at all. It feels like a lot of the Eagles' passing offense is straight dropbacks, and there's not easy buttons within this offense for Jalen Hurts to just read one defender, okay, I like the look. I'm going to throw it. It seems like this year Jalen Hurts has to do much more processing. And part of that is how the defenses are playing him. But I think another part of that, a huge part of that, is Brian Johnson's system versus what Shane Steichen brought last year.
And I think we should have expected that too. Johnson's a first time NFL play caller, but he hasn't called in 6 years since his time at Houston in 2017. That's when the Eagles were winning a Super Bowl. Whereas Shane Steichen simplifies the offense so much, Anthony Richardson, his debut is going toe-to-toe with Trevor Lawrence. So that speaks to the type of genius they lost here, how good of a coach he was at opening up the offense. So it's no surprise it's probably going to take 6 weeks here for this offense to get into a state of flow. And then by then, I think we can judge more so.
And now, before we get off the Jalen Hurts subject, I do want to talk a little bit about the Eagles defense because I do think Sean Desai has done a pretty good job given the personnel he's had to work with. The back end of the Eagles was very hobbled today. They had to start Josh Jobe. And really, the Vikings passing attack was predicated a lot on the Eagles' mistakes on the back end today.
We saw it with the Jordan Addison touchdown. Jettis almost got in there too if it weren't for the extension to a touchback. And that's what the Vikings want to play. That's what their offense is built off of. And to be honest with you, I felt like the Eagles, they got away here with the millions of drops it felt like the Vikings had on top of the fumbles. There are so many times today from every single player in this Vikings offense. One of them is KJ Osborne late in the game where he's almost giving up a pick six, balls ricocheting off his chest plate, where it's like, Philadelphia is not always going to catch these breaks late in the year, so it's going to be interesting to monitor.
Now, before we move on to the rushing attack, for those that are watching on YouTube right now, if you're listening on audio, you cannot see this, but right now, what me and John are looking at is Jalen Hurts' passing chart from tonight's game. Not a lot of deep shots, really, not a lot of deep shots. You can tell that Brian Flores' defense was playing at soft zone and forcing Jalen Hurts to really hit these short areas of the field.
He had the deep shot down there at Devontae. You can barely see it at the tippy top. And that was what opened up the game for them. Like they were just kind of like running in mud, nothing past the chains. Once they have that break in coverage and Devontae goes off for 100 plus yards, it kind of was a reminder of how explosive they can be.
And to be fair to Hurts, he did have that great play where he was pressured and took a big time hit and hit a deep ball to Devontae Smith that ended up being a touchdown. That was a phenomenal play. And nobody is saying that Jalen Hurts is not capable of doing that. But to this point, he just hasn't done it at a good level, an above average level. That was a good step in the right direction, but I don't think that one play erases the entire sample size we had of him versus the blitz and versus the zone coverages.
That's
Now,
interesting.
oh, what you were gonna
I
say?
felt like the other thing too is that we're not seeing enough of the intermediate crossing routes. Like I'm waiting to see more of that, and we have in the first 2 weeks. That might be what AJ Brown excels most at and getting him going. So if anything, that's going to be something Brian Johnson's got to add in here.
And we saw Jalen Hurts and AJ Brown get into it on the sideline. AJ Brown frustrated with Jalen Hurts. The coaches had to pull them aside. Never like to see that. Now, let's move on to a positive part of the Eagles offense tonight, which was the Eagles rushing attack. Now, DeAndre Swift, 175 yards, 28 carries, one touchdown, eighth highest success rate since 2016 by a player with 25 plus carries. Now, if you're an Eagles fan, you're looking at this game and the game versus the Patriots, and it's two completely different worlds because versus the Vikings, DeAndre Swift had a 72% success rate versus the Patriots. The Eagles rushing attack had a 32% success rate. Now, some people will attribute that to DeAndre Swift getting in the game. I think this Vikings defense, this rush defense, they were giving it up, because they were playing that zone coverage and playing back. They didn't have a lot of bodies in a run. Listen, DeAndre Swift had that late 43-yard run, which was exceptional. But for the entire game, I understand Swift was getting this yardage, but the holes were massive. I mean, the holes were gaping.
They were he was gashing them in the run, but I don't think we can discredit him when he had 175 yards on the ground. So the Vikings game plan is to give that up. And DeAndre Swift, look, in Detroit, Lion fans have grown sick of him. So they're like, all right, Philadelphia, you go deal with his problems. He's not good in between the tackles, and he wants to bounce everything outside. But when the Vikings front is really just three or four guys sometimes, he was running as hard as he ever has. And he was hitting the outside game first downs again and again and again. So considering how much of a threat Jalen Hurts is as a rusher, considering how good their offensive line is, I mean, shit. Miles Sanders was a top 10 running back in production last year. I kind of wonder if DeAndre Swift can do that same exact thing because the Lions are the great interior offensive line, but they didn't have the tackle play the Eagles do now, Mailata and Lane Johnson. And they also, might be a slight drop off between Jared Goff and Jalen Hurts, the rusher. I'm not entirely sure, but I think each of those two things are going to kind of make it a pretty huge year for him going to year four. And he could get paid this offseason because of it.
And that's what helps out DeAndre Swift in his offense so much is that the offensive line is even better than the Lions. And then you have defenses have a rushing quarterback they have to worry about. So it leaves for a lot of room for any running back. Boston Scott, before he left the game, was averaging 8 yards per carry. And then DeAndre Swift just came in and picked up where he left off and just did his thing. It is kind of funny though, when I'm looking at DeAndre Swift's chart, that DeAndre Swift, his rushing yards over expectation was plus 41, and he had 175 yards, which I mean, it's good. But before the 43-yard run, DeAndre Swift's rushing yards over expectation was like at negative zero point zero 0.01, which means that by expectation, DeAndre Swift wasn't even running that great. But, listen, it's a great rushing game. I feel like the Vikings defense, they play voodoo on viewers watching at home because last year we saw in the playoffs when Daniel Jones scorched that defense. Daniel Jones is top 10 now. Daniel Jones, whenever a player faces the Vikings defense on a prime time matchup, the players tend to get a little bit overrated. And I'm not saying DeAndre Swift didn't have a great day because he did, but let's pump the brakes a little bit. Kenny Gainwell did not play. Boston Scott was a lead back before he got hurt in this game. Fantasy managers of DeAndre Swift are happy everywhere, but I'm not sure how sustainable this is going to be, especially considering the Eagles' road of run defense is going to get much tougher. And I'm not sure how many run defenses are going to face as weak as the Vikings run defense.
You are right. There's no get right game like playing Minnesota on Thursday night prime time. And I would trade DeAndre Swift immediately after this game. But why do I got to ask you this question? Rashad Penny's a guy averaged 6 yards a carry in Seattle. And the issue always was he couldn't stay healthy. Couldn't play more than 6 games a year, but he popped in the 10 games he was. You then put him behind this Philadelphia offensive line. I feel like you'd average 9 yards a carry, honestly. So I got to ask you, like, why is he not getting any more than 3 rushes? Because if anything, he's the best back here to me.
I have no idea. And I think by name, Rashad Penny probably is like the best back on the team, but he suffered so many injuries. He's coming back from an Achilles injury. We're not sure if that same explosiveness is there anymore for Penny, which, if it was, I am pretty certain they would be playing him, but I just don't think it's there anymore. And on the few carries that I did see from him this game, they didn't really pop off to me. It kind of felt like the Vikings defense played better when Rashad Penny was on the field.
That's fair. I guess, I didn't notice those carries because it doesn't matter who you have in the backfield here. Like, if you're an Eagles running back, you're going to get 100 yards a game. Like,
Yeah.
doesn't matter what your name is.
But the next upcoming games for the Eagles are the Buccaneers, the Commanders, the Rams, and the Jets. I would say 3 or 4 really good rushing defenses. So this is the test. And I think this is a game where Todd Bowles loves to blitz a lot. So that's going to be a test for Jalen Hurts. The Commanders, last year, we saw Jalen Hurts didn't have the best game against them on a primetime night. And the Jets, I mean, we blitz, we can get home with our front four. We play a lot of zone defense. So this is not only going to be a big test for Jalen Hurts, but I also think it's going to be a big test for the Eagles rushing attack altogether.
Well said.
Now, on to the next topic. The Vikings wasted a great Kirk Cousins game, my friend. Kirk Cousins, he's somebody that I really love as a quarterback because I don't think he gets his due diligence. And today, You can chalk it up to the Eagles secondary not being all the way there, but 31 for 44, 364 yards, 4 touchdowns, 125.6 passer rating. He took less sacks than Jalen Hurts. He took half the sacks Jalen Hurts took and double the dropbacks. And
That's
Kirk
not a real
was
stat.
pressured.
That's not a real stat.
Kirk took 2 sacks and he was pressured exponentially more than Jalen Hurts.
So Christian Darrisaw is hurt. You have arguably the worst right guard I've ever seen at Ingram, in all due respect. And Jalen Hurts is the best offense. That can't be right because Kirk Cousins last year is the most hit quarterback in the NFL, over 100 times. And it hasn't been much better to start this year. And the narrative has always been, look, Kirk cannot win on prime time. The one game he did was the one game he had the moment. But his last two primetime games, he's been lights out. We saw him in the playoffs, outside of throwing short of the sticks with your season on the line because no one was open. He was very good versus that Giants defense.
Mhm.
It's like at 360 yards, it would have easily been 400 if it weren't for the drops. And who knows with the 4 fumbles as well. You not only lose Dalvin Cook, who is better than Alexander Madison as a receiving threat, but KJ Osborne, the drops again. Jordan Addison's great, but you would hope that Osborne as that third receiver has reliable hands. And I'm just like, damn, I think the entire narrative about Kirk Cousins being terrible on primetime and this stage of his career, it has to change.
I've made a video a while back about Kirk Cousins and the false narrative around his primetime performances. And Kirk Cousins has addressed this before. He said, listen, when you play on primetime, you're oftentimes facing the better teams in the NFL, and you need a team to win those games. You need a team to win those games. This game, Kirk Cousins did have a fumble, but let's just go back to how the game started. The Eagles punted, and the punt returner, Brandon Powell, fumbles the ball. Alexander Madison, shortly after, gets a carry and fumbles as well. The Vikings had 0 rushing first downs this game. The Eagles had 10. Justin Jefferson is going to the pylon and fumbles it into the end zone, something that I don't see from Justin Jefferson. And that could have been the point swing that maybe led to the Vikings getting this victory out. And then, of course, the sack on Kirk where he fumbled and it gave the Eagles great field position. Right now, I believe the Vikings have 6 turnovers on the season,
They do on fumbles alone. He
on
had an
fumbles
interception
alone.
last week. What do you think, though, before we talk about that, about the NFL? Should they change the goal line fumble rule? Because usually Derek Carr special, or you extend and you lose it and it's a touchback. Is it a stupid rule? Is it reasonable? What do you think?
I think it's a reasonable rule because, for one, when players fumble in the field of play, the offense gets the ball back wherever you fumbled. Maybe we should give that to the opposing team. Maybe that should be a fumble and that should go to the opposing team's direction. It's not hard to ask for the offensive players to hold on to the football. There are so many rules geared to helping NFL offenses in the modern days. Defenses are at a huge disadvantage. So if you can't hold on to the ball, getting to the pylon, then 100% you should not get the ball back. I don't think that's fair. And I think if you fumble, because all the time when we see players fumble and then the ball goes out of bounds, we have a sigh of relief, like, oh, thank God. But ultimately, that should be going the other team's way because the offensive player should hold on to the football. They should keep the possession.
If you're fumbling outright, I would agree with you. But if you're reaching for the pylon now, I feel like if anything, you should just have the ball sent back to your 25. You lose the 20 yards, but to me, losing possession when you're a yard away from a touchdown, I think is too big of a simple point disparity here. Just say, oh, goodbye. That entire set 3 to 7 points, 5 on average, wiping all that away. I don't think that's fair. I think the best way to go about it is you get the ball at the 25 and you lose it down.
But here's the difference. I would agree with you if you're losing the ball when the ball touches the end zone. Well, not when the ball touches the end zone, but when it reaches the end zone. Justin Jefferson was about a yard away before the ball left his hands and went into the end zone. For me, once the ball reaches the pylon and you have clear possession, that's a touchdown. I don't feel like you need to come all the way to the ground with it for you to get that touchdown. But if you are fumbling a yard or two away from the end zone, you don't reach it. I mean, and it goes into the end zone. Listen, it's marginal, but yeah, I think that you should lose possession there.
There's a gray area here, and I think you and I both know that the NFL is never going to change this. But
Now, Kirk Cousins, he had the great, phenomenal day. I really want to talk about this Vikings team and their direction, really, because last year they were 11-0 in one score games. Well, the first two games of the season, I predicted before the year started that, listen, the Vikings are going to regress in these one score games. I didn't know they start out 0-2 in one score games, but here we are. This is kind of the nature of playing with a team that the defense is going to let up points, the offense has to keep up, which means that every game you play in is going to be a shootout. And this is what it was for the Vikings. Now, for me, I don't predict the Vikings being a 10-win team. I think that based on the talent level of this roster, given the defense, even though Brian Flores is doing more things with it, he is playing more zone coverage. They're not getting torched like last year. The defense still isn't very talented. The offensive line is already injured. And even when it's healthy, outside of Christian Darrisaw, you can't count on anybody else to really hold up. Maybe Brian O'Neill a little bit. This offense is going to be fun to watch because they can pass the hell out of the ball. Justin Jefferson is the best receiver in the game. Jordan Addison is an amazing rookie. KJ Osborne is a really good number 3. And TJ Hawkinson at the side end is one of the best security blankets. But this team does not have a running game. I was told this entire offseason that Alexander Madison was going to take this type of leap. But if you've watched Madison for 4 years now, you've come to the same conclusion as I. And that's that Alexander Madison just isn't that good. He's not a starting level running back. So they don't have a running game. They can't protect Kirk Cousins. Their defense isn't that good. The only thing this team leans on is the passing attack. And for me, that's a sub 500 team. That's a team that's going to win 7, 8 games, and Kirk Cousins is not under contract past this year.
let me tell you this. The positive is the Vikings just drafted a second star receiver to pair up alongside Justin Jefferson. You weighed it. I felt Jordan Addison was the perfect number 2 to come in and benefit from all that opportunity. TJ Hawkinson is a wonderful third piece, so to speak. But to me, it's not necessarily the rushing attack. It's more so Kirk Cousins, 34 years old, and there is no future plan at QB. Because for as well as Kirk Cousins is playing, the Vikings are going to be in the state for the next 2 to 3 years with him if they extend him. This is where you're going to be a 7 to 11 win team. That's the ceiling and that's the floor, other way around. And so they're not going to be in position to get those top 7, top 8 picks in the draft to target those players. And a draft class like this, especially, this is generational. Caleb Williams, Drake May, and some good secondary prospects. You may have to wait another 3 or 4 years for that draft class. And so for the Vikings, I feel like this is the ultimate bridge year. The Jets, they just lost Aaron Rodgers for the season. If you can get a second round pick for Kirk Cousins on expiring contract, and then you reset for 1 year, you tank this year, which sounds ridiculous when you've got as good of an offense in the skill set department as you do. Now you at least put yourself in that camp of teams where we can at worst get a Shador Sanders, and you can get him hell in the end of the first round. We'll see. A guy like Quinn Ewers, Drake May. To me, the Vikings' big opportunity right now is okay. We won 11 games last year. It's been a fun run. Second year GM, I believe. Second year head coach. You want to find the long term solution for Justin Jefferson when you give him that $35 million per year contract. Because the reality is, in this NFL, you can have as many star receivers as you want. But if your quarterback is 34, he's being hit like there's no tomorrow, and he's not necessarily a guy that you think will carry you over the top, you got to look for the alternative long term.
You know, out of all the Jets quarterback options that I've heard the backups that are on the market that I don't want any part of. I've heard of Kyler Murray. I have not heard Kirk Cousins. If the Jets are bad with Zach Wilson, I would say pull the trigger on Kirk Cousins. Kyler Murray, I don't want because the contract is too much. The injury history is there. If the Jets know that Zach Wilson isn't going to win them games or be serviceable enough so they could stay afloat in the games, Go trade for Kirk Cousins on an expiring contract. You don't have to give a crazy pickup to go get Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins now goes to the Jets. Maybe he has a fantastic year because I love Kirk. And then you either make the decision of keeping Aaron off an injury or Kirk, and you have Kirk hit the open market. I don't know. It's an up in the air situation. But I think the only thing holding the Jets back from doing something like that is just you're asking Kirk Cousins to come into a new team, learn an entire new playbook, learn a new offense. That's a really big learning curve and a lot to ask from Kirk
In the middle of the season too.
in the
I
middle of
hope
the
for Kirk.
season.
Kirk's a family guy. And this is I hate to be reciting your tweets, but you did also tweet this too. He's a guy that loves Minnesota. And moving him may be too big of a change for him to come in and ball out. And I was wrong. He's 35 years old, just turned in August. So
Wow.
look, that is the ultimate, I think. Another great one, Mason Rudolph, the Jets, not playing.
Oh no.
For the Vikings, that's my ultimate question, though. Because if you go through this year, you become a 9-win team, there's a chance you win the NFC North, but the Packers look great. The Lions look really good. It might not be that year for you. And so I'm just like, the future here is somewhat, but not really stable. You have stability at all the weapon groups. You've built a good tackle duo. The defense should improve. Should is a key word here. It's just the quarterback at the end of the day. That is what's going to matter for this franchise because for quite some time now, they've built good rosters, but that has been unstable. And it's weird to say that at the same time because Kirk was a huge bright spot for them tonight. It's just the age, the hits, and the long term foresight.
Now, before we get out of here, some stats that stuck out to me. I'm looking at the Eagles and Vikings game. The Vikings had 19 passing first downs to the Eagles 4. The Eagles had 19 rushing first downs to the Vikings 0. That's such a big discrepancy. Third down efficiency, the Vikings were 6 for 10, the Eagles were 6 for 14. And it makes sense because on third down, it was easily one of Jalen Hurts' worst down tonight, especially when Brian Flores would drop the players back into that zone. And Jalen Hurts, man, what I want to see him do better is I want to see him scan the field better because I feel like oftentimes when he drops back and doesn't get the initial look he likes, he holds the ball, he starts to scramble, he bails. And that was exactly what Brian Flores wanted him to do. Third and 12, okay, Jalen Hurts, run it. We have a linebacker right there ready to stop you 4 yards into your rush. We'll give that up. And I just felt like Jalen Hurts kept running into that trap of what Brian Flores dictated that offense to do.
That's why a guy like Kyler Murray is a better quarterback. Oh, I think it's true.
Eagles fans can
You're
come
right.
after you for that one, man.
They've been coming after me big time, but you know what? It's the truth sometimes.
But yeah, man, that's going to do it for this episode of the Joel Moran Show, talking about the Eagles and the Vikings Thursday night football matchup. What's the issue with the Eagles offense right now? At least they're passing offense because they haven't been able to find a groove against the Patriots or the Vikings. Rushing offense was amazing, though, tonight. Any last words you want to say, John, before we go?
Let's get ready to fumble. That was all I think, man.
All right. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you guys next time.